Hello there, and welcome to my tutorial for the advanced world generation in Dwarf Fortress. This is going to go over all the different settings here, and I'm going to do my best to give you an understanding of all the things that you can do there. I'll really had to prepare for this video a very long time, and I really hope to get the information across in a way that is understandable for you. Feel free to ask away if anything remains unclear. It is by far one of the most demanding and complicated tools in this game, but it also includes a lot of power. That all being said, let's get started with a couple of very basic things. None of the setups in this basic mode will apply into the detailed mode. So if you go and press buttons here, this won't change anything about the settings here, just as one thing up ahead. Up here, we have our predefined default parameters. These are just a couple of default settings that you can experiment around with, and you can also click New Parameter Set, give it your own name, and save it afterwards to create your own default. Very useful, since there's a lot of work and tinkering involved with these things, and often you will roll a few worlds and tune that gauge a little bit higher, that gauge a little bit lower, and so on and so forth. I can only recommend saving your parameter sets while you're tinkering with them. Width and height of a world, I don't think I need to explain much about that. The easy, cool part here is that we can create different sizes of worlds with different dimensions comparatively to the standard settings. Seeding your world will result in identical worlds as long as the settings are the same. A world with randomized seeds will be different each time you roll it, even if the settings are the same. That is what seeds are good for. The embark points allow you to make your embarkation when you preparing carefully more powerful or less powerful. This end here is just where your world creation process will end, and these caps here will allow you to define how many historical people will be in the world creation tops. If you put this on -1, you will disable these caps. Just be sure that you don't have this number too low. It's worth mentioning that these caps don't assure a amount of things. This is only setting up a maximum number for these. The world will still have to have the necessary hospitability, for example, for the 15,000 people to live here. Keep in mind that this is only historical people, so people that do actually something that will be in your descriptions, and most goblin raiders attacking you won't be historical figures, so you're not defining the total population of your world here for real. That being said, let's move on over to the next one. These two parameters here will define in which year the game will check how many Forgotten Beasts are still alive. Currently, if at the year 300, 80% of the Forgotten Beasts are dead, the world creation will restart. Ironically enough, this setting has no effect in the standard default setting because world creation ends at 250. Culling of unimportant historical figures and revealing all historical events are the first one. Is just smallening the size of your world, which can be quite interesting, and this is just for the sake of fluff. Okay, now we're going on over to the terrain things. So, here we have a recurring system. I want to explain the system first by taking elevation as an example, and then go for some things worth knowing about this thing. So, minimum and maximum values, I think they are pretty self-explanatory. With this setting, the lowest possible height of a grid is 1, and the highest possible height is 400. So far, so clear. If we make these numbers higher, we will create a world that is just located higher in altitude. Worth mentioning here, oceans and bodies of water need to have an elevation of 99 or lower. So if we make a world like that, no bodies of water can occur anymore. Very important to note that. With the elevation, it's pretty similar. 300 is what you need for mountains. If you have a world with 299, no more mountains. And 400 is required for mountain peaks. So no more mountain peaks this way. You can utilize this to your own liking. So, X and Y variance is a little bit more difficult to explain. It basically tells the game how much variance there can be between one grid and its neighbor. X-Variance defines the east and west axis. Y-Variance is the north and south axis. So if I'd be putting the variance now to something very, very low, let's say 10, this would result in every grid, let's say our grid in question has a elevation of 10. This grid will now check, is my neighbor east and is my neighbor west? Which heights can they have? Only like 11 or 12 because we have forbidden a high amount of variance. So this will result in small flowing increases of height, whereas if we'd be putting this onto maximum, we can have all manners of extreme differences between any tile located east or west from one another. So the standard settings here are 800 and 800, which will result in pretty organic worlds. You can define that for yourself to your own liking. This system works now for all the other parameters the same. So we define what's the minimum rainfall, what's the maximum rainfall, and how much variance can there be to the neighbors. The higher the variance, the wilder patchwork maps will occur, and the lower the variance, the smoother the transitions will go. Also keep in mind, putting the minimum rainfall too high will erase the possibility of deserts to form, because, you know, rain. Minimum and maximum temperature, I think this is now self-explanatory, and drainage is not that much of a self-explanatory thing, I think. Easily put, low drainage levels build up bodies of water, like rivers, seas, and the like. High drainage levels create hills because the water can just flow away, and what remains is solid land. Here we can do the same shenanigans as usual. I just wanted to explain how drainage works. Volcanism. Important to note, for a volcano to occur, the volcanism value on that grid must be 100. So if you put your volcanism on 99, you won't have any volcanoes on your world anymore. For more volcanism occurring, it is also not helpful to put the minimal volcanism on 100, because that will result in a world of volcanoes, which will also get rejected. All in all, you can increase this number a bit for volcanoes to spawn more often, or you can also increase the variance between the tiles to higher levels to make it more likely for a volcano to spawn, because if we put these both values on 3200 here, for example, every grid gets a free roll of a chance to be a 100 grid. You see, that's just the idea behind it. So, savagery is just simply put how wild the world tile will be. And here again, if we make the savagery go too low, no more wild biomes can spawn, and vice versa. Pretty simple. Now, mesh sizes. This is very confusing at first, and even after understanding the tool, it can be pretty hard to get results out of it. So, first of all, I want to explain what it's good for. This allows you to define a region size, so how large is the mesh supposed to be, and then we can define how is the elevation distributed inside that mesh. So if we now make something like this happen, this configuration will now divide the world into meshes of a 4x4 size, as many of them as possible, and then it will distribute the elevation like this. 0 to 20% of your settings up here. This is always referring to the minimum maximum settings here. So it will now try to distribute the elevation inside this mesh as follows. Since it has only two parts, one part will be all distributed in the lower 20%, which means 1 to 80 elevation level, and the other part will be located in the higher elevation level. So this setup would end up in a world full of extreme height changes. If we now make it like this, which is the standard setting, it's evenly distributed. The percentile areas of your changes, because that's what this is representing. This is the first 20% of your variance set here. So the first 20% of this, next 20%, the next 20%, the next 20%. So for example, if we would be now putting on like this, we'd have one part on the lowest, one part on the 20 to 40%, 10 parts on the 40 to 60% area, which would be elevation levels somewhere around the 200s, and the remaining parts would fall to the rest of that. This would now result in a world that would have a lot of plateaus with some really deep or really high areas. You can mix and match that to your own liking. You can change the mesh size. Just keep in mind, the higher the mesh size, the higher the world size needs to be for that to be fully working. If this is all super complicated and you haven't still understood a thing, don't worry, it's by far one of the most complicated parts, and feel free to ask away in the comment section. I'm willing to put up a demonstrational video about this as well, because I really haven't found a better way to explain it. Now, these meshes can now be applied to anything, not only to elevation. You can select how rain should be distributed in the world, how drainage, savagery, temperature, volcanism, all those things. You can use this mesh system for all manner of different things. This is basically the tool which allows you to distribute the chances to your own liking. That's what it is, and not more, not less. Pretty hard to understand, though. I personally found it extremely hard to understand, that is. Now, off to easier things. The poles, well, we can't define how the poles are. That's that. The total amount of minimum mountain peaks, pretty easy to understand as well. Keep in mind, if you have tinkered with the elevation levels so that there are no mountain peaks possible anymore, you will have only rejected worlds here. That's very important to note. You can make worlds impossible to create if you don't know what you're doing here. That's the worst part about it. Partial edge ocean means the map's border is just touching an ocean body somewhere. So this means one part of the map will touch the ocean somewhere. Doesn't even mean that there will be much water on that end of the map, but there will be some piece of ocean on one part of the map, and so on and so forth. If you put this on none, both values, you will have an inland area which has no access to ocean at all. Complete edge oceans, like the name implies, here we have one complete shoreline on one edge of the map, two edges of the map, three edges of the map. This is very similar like Florida, for example, and four edges of the map will result in an island. Very simple. Minimum volcano number, like you see here, this is the best way to actually force the world to have a nice amount of volcanoes. That's at least my personal go-to tool, because minimum and maximum volcanism area things to change isn't necessarily the best way. This is, in my opinion, the best way. Mineral scarcity. Now, I don't know why they made it this way, but the higher the number, the less minerals there are. So I want to give you a quick look over that. The setting of 100 is the setting for everywhere in the basic world setting. If you make this number 500, you have frequent in the basic world settings. 2,500 represents sparse, 10,000 represents rare, and 50,000 represents very rare. So for a challenge, you want to put this at least at 50,000 or even higher, because 100,000 is very low then. So here we can configure the amount of Megabeasts and semi-Megabeasts that live on your world. This number, if it is too high, will result in civilizations dying out, because, you know, these things kill civilizations from time to time. So keep that in mind. If you want to have more beasts, there is a limit to that, or you need to tinker around with that. Titan number, it's the same thing. I just want to explain the attack population rating things here, because this is a mechanic that we will see more often. This defines at which population level Titans will attack your fortress. If this is here, they can attack at any time. Here, 20 dwarfs, 50 dwarfs, I don't know if it was 80 or 100, and this is all the way to 200 dwarfs up. I don't know exactly the numbers here, but this is basically configuring how high the population count has to be before this event can trigger. Same thing for exported wealth and created wealth. Sadly, I wasn't able to extract any precise numbers with all my research I wasn't doing. Anyways, let me know if you know. That's all that it does. And now we go on over to more monster things. So here we can define the total amount of different demons in our world. Night trolls, bogeymen, and nightmares will not occur in the fortress mode too much. They are mostly inhabitants of the adventure mode. You won't be seeing these. Very interesting here, vampire curses and werebeast curses. If we put these on 0, there will be no vampires, no werebeasts on the world. It also increases the total amount of different werebeasts and the total amount of different possibilities for these events to spawn. So the higher the number, the more of these denizens you will have. Here we have the same setup for werebeasts, which is standard at 50 dwarves. So if you feel like that's crappy, you can increase or decrease that to your own liking, or disable the critters altogether. Up to you. Number of secret types is the amount of different ways to become a necromancer. And these here, regional interactions, currently only define how many different nasty things can happen in evil biomes. It's only configuring evil biomes. Technically, it would also be influential for good biomes or whatever interactions there can be. It just defines how many different things can happen in a evil biome currently, and this is the same for the points down below. Basically, the higher you have these numbers, the harder it will be to foresee what's happening in these biomes specifically, because it will roll a new set of parameters each time. Divine materials, yes or no? I don't think I need to explain much about that. Here we get to configure a little bit what necromancers are allowed to do, essentially increasing or decreasing the difficulty of these. And now we have more distribution things. The remaining set, or much of the thing here, will be now about distribution of map tiles and defining what is coming up on your map in which ratios. This also is one of the parts where you can mess up your map quite horribly, because if there is a mismatch between the settings down here and the settings up above, it will result in worlds that cannot be rolled. That just as a thing that I wanted to put up ahead. Now, here we can now define how many squares a good or evil, small, medium, or large subregion must have. So this basically also defines that every small subregion in a size of 1 to 99 can't be good, because it has to have 100 at least. So basically you can predefine the sizes of these subregions a little bit with that. Also keep in mind, this always has to correlate with your world size. So the moment you change the world size, as you see here, these parameters drop as well, because, you know, the world is only featuring so and so many squares after all. Also worth mentioning, if the world grows small enough, you notice that there is no more grid count for the large subregions. That is because in a small world, large subregions don't grow that large, and the moment I set up something like that, every large subregion will be either tinted good or evil, because the game is not capable to have different alignments in one subregion. The entire subregion is either good, evil, or neutral. So this way, fidgeting around with these, you can turn up the occurrence and size of good and evil areas in your world. It is pretty difficult though, and I spent a lot of time tinkering with the setup that made me happy. That just as a side note. So moving on down to the other parts here. So here we get to distribute again. How are the squares shuffled? So here we set up how many minimum squares of wetland are there at the beginning. Desert, forest, and so on and so forth. And we also define how many regions of that we start with while we're creating the world, and how many of these regions have to remain at the end of the world creation cycle. So basically, if we put it down like that, we will have 252 squares of a world wetland. One region of that will host all of that wetland, or at least one region. There can be more. We're only defining the minimum, not the maximum. But at the end of the day, our map or world generation won't be bothered if that wetland evolves away. And that's that. Here you can define that now for all different biomes. So you can set up how many initial squares are what in your world and how many of these regions you want to have. So for example, here we can also define that we want a glacier region at the end of the map creation as well. Tundra, grassland, whatever. So if you want a certain type of biome spawn more often, these are the gauges to play around with. Erosion cycle count. This is defining how much erosion will have happened in the world. If you put this down to 0, the elevations in the world will be crass, steep elevations without any ramps leading upwards, and the more erosion cycles you have, the smoother the things are, and the less problematic it is to go upwards somewhere. So basically this way you can define how many steep cliffs you want to have or not. So here we have again something very similar, how many rivers we have at the beginning and how many we end up after the erosion. These two things are quite interesting. So periodically erode extreme cliffs. If you set this to no, you will end up with very extreme cliffs that can't be climbed directly. As long as this is yes, extreme cliffs will end up with a couple of ramps allowing you to always get up there. That's what it is good for. Aureographic precipitation and rain shadows. Basically, this is whether you want to have heights influence rainfall or not. Basically, this is configuring if hillsides and mountains do influence rainfall or not. That's what this thing is good for, as far as I understood it. So, maximum number of subregions. This is very important to have on a very high number if you have lots of small subregions configured and your world is too large. Because sometimes if you tell the game that a subregion can be very small, you can end up with more subregions than your world can tackle. That's what it is good for. So this ends the whole distribution part, and we are now entering the Caverns configurations. So first off, we define how many layers of the caverns are there. Pretty simple and straightforward. Nothing big to explain. If you are a seasoned veteran to this game, you know what these three are good for. You can even disable the caverns entirely. So, openness, minimum and maximum, versus passage density, minimum and maximum. So, openness defines how much open space there is in a cavern layer, minimum or maximum. Passage density is defining how many passageways will lead through there. So you can mix and match that to your own liking. Basically, it's quite simple. If there is no openness but a lot of passage density, you will have lots of labyrinthine corridors. If you have lots of openness but no density, you will have open, wide squares which have no tunnels whatsoever. And if you have a mixture between these, well, you can get the idea. It does take a lot of experience to experiment around with that, and I strongly recommend to read into the Dwarf Fortress Wikipedia entry that I've linked down there to give you a couple of ideas how this works in detail and what you can do with it. So, cavern layer, water, minimum and maximum. If you set this up to, if you increase the minimum to a high enough level, you will end up with caverns that always will have water on their lowest level. This will not mean that all the caverns will be fully immersed in water, even if you put 100 to 100. This only means that there will be always water in every layer, but also land masses usually emerge. So here we can also now define if we want to have the magma sea layer or not, and if we want to have the, well, fun layer. Let's call it like that. The layer below the magma. All right? You can turn it off or on. So here, this next thing is very interesting too. So Z levels above ground defines how much air will be between the highest land on your map and upwards. So basically, if you have a mountain peak that is on Z level 90, this setup will make sure that 15 levels of air will be above the Z level 90. You can increase that all the way to 100 if you want to build stupidly high towers. This is what you need for that project. Z levels above layer 1. This defines the minimal amount of soil or stone between your regular entry level of stone and the first layer of caverns. Basically, this means we have to reach at least 5 layers of stone before we can even have a chance of finding caverns layer 1. And this you can configure to your own liking. Keep in mind though, this is the minimal amount. I had it lately that I had to reach like 90 layers still with this kind of configuration. It only tells the minimal amount of layers in between. Here's the same thing. Here it defines the minimal amount of layers between the lowest part of Caverns Tier 1 and the highest part of Caverns Tier 2. That's the difference between Caverns Tier 2 and Tier 3. That's the difference between Caverns Tier 3 and the Magma Sea, and the Magma Sea and the other stuff. And here you can also define how deep the other stuff is supposed to be. I never had a chance to experiment around with that yet, but that's what it is. So natural caves and mountain caves and these things, you usually won't see them at all. They spawn during world creation and are interesting little structures in the world. If you want to see them, make them visible in your world creation. It's a pretty nifty little thing. And here we can also show tunnels. That's not so interesting here. Number of civilizations. So here we can again create the minimum number of starting civilizations. You can also define this way how much ruckus and war and crashes will be around. Here we can define if there needs to be a playable civilization still. So if you want to watch a world creation just for a very long amount of time, you can turn it to no. So here we have now at last a distribution meter of the minimum amount of all these things. So this is a nifty little thing to tell the game that it should ignore certain things. And here we could now tell the game that it doesn't need to care about the low elevation squares or whatnot. Here you can erase out world rejections that bother you, but you can also define how the world's altitudes should be distributed. This is a nice way of configuring things if the mesh method is too complicated for you. So for example, we can now tell the game that we want a total of 10,000 low altitude squares and 10,000 high altitude squares and only 13,000 low. You see, I named it now wrong, but you can just define this way how your world is supposed to be composed. This is very, very cool if you don't want to have standard distributions. And we've successfully reached the end of the list. I really hope that this was helpful for you. Let me know in the comment section what kind of questions you have. Please add in any corrections that you have, because I really did my best to research this, but it's been a pretty harsh topic on me. Thumbs up and subscriptions would be wildly welcome. I put, of course, the link to my Dwarf Fortress tutorial playlist down there as well. And big thanks to the supporters of the channel, and check out Patreon, PayPal, or Buy Me a Coffee if you want to support me. I'd be very, very happy about that. That all being said, thanks for being around, and I hope you will create wonderful worlds now. See you there, and have a good one.